God created. And when they say in the beginning, it's not a beginning for God. God has no beginning. God never had a beginning at all. He ever was, ever shall be. Alpha and Omega. His existence is confirmed. His being is there, and that's who we are. We come from God. And so the depth of who we are is so potent and so powerful until we must know this inside and out to understand who we are. And when we begin to fathom who we are, we must know that we must be about the family business. We must realize how far behind we are when we talk about global white supremacy and about the economic decay and problems that we have. We should never have had these problems. Why? Because in the beginning we were given power and dominion over the earth. The African Edenic system, the model that was pure and not polluted, was a model that was not fallen. And not fallen meant that we had power and dominion over the land. So we should never be caught up in these frauds and these webs internationally in the global system, wondering whether we should owe this one and owe that one on the international market and squeezing Africa until it's practically nothing or out of existence and redefining things until we don't know whether we're coming and going. Thank God for Brother Stedman, who is here as a leader here for you, and all of the speakers that have spoken this day to give us the fervor and the information that we need to continue to know and understand who we are and how to be who we are in a practical manner. For we are the people that come from a very esoteric realm, high up with God and with our magnificence and glory, but we are of no avail if we cannot deal with the practicality of the here and now. I salute the young man that was speaking right before me because he's dealing with that reality. We all should not be involved in a family that grandiose and big and have children walking around orphaned and destitute or impoverished. As long as they're a family like this, they should be people that would pick them up. And saying that, I say that I'm married to Leonard Jefferies. I stand before you to introduce you to him. And I can say when we got married 30 years ago, we inherited right away a 14-year-old young man. And that young man was one from Piney Bluff, Mississippi, an African who was Americanized and who we were supposed to be guardians over. And the same week of our honeymoon, and we end up losing him and finding him on the stage of the Apollo Theater. And so I say that to say to you that we are obligated to go out and pick up and find those that are wayward and bring them into the fold. A little love and care will go a long way, but also the black history will go even further. To know who you are is so vital because it creates and makes a soul and a being that will last a long time. And so that you must be active, engaged. Don't let Brother Stedman have to stand over here, stand up and beg you to do this, that, and the other. But work closer and firmer together to get to know each other and not be afraid of each other, but to understand, come from this point of view of the understanding. And so I introduce and bring before you, you already mentioned Leonard's name over and over and over again, and so I bring to you a man who I had to begin to know and to understand myself in a lifetime living, and can't say that I understand and know him completely. And so that we can say, though, when two beings come together and you have like minds and your interests, for your love of people and your race and your people, you stand up as two firm individuals motivated by God. You have the liberation. A good marriage is a marriage where each person has the liberation of their own identity to stand up whole, and God is your force first. And then the people and the mating and the family blends and melts, and things go as they should. All things are in its rightful order when you could put God first. And so in the part of the understanding Leonard even the more, I was end up teaching African American history, and the more I delve in a subject that I too love, I begin to understand more and more about him. And in the process, there's some things that he's engaged in. Now, I don't know how a human being does it. Example, how could somebody leave early in the morning, go down to Georgia, come back, try to get back in the evening to go to an all-night African funeral celebration, and then before you even had any sleep, then come running down trying to get the African echoes? I don't know. And so once again, I'm introducing to you someone who I've lived with for 30 years, but I can say honestly I don't completely know how a man goes like Leonard Jefferies without much sleep, without eating sometimes, and yet he's fired up to do the job that has to be done. And so we say to you, I say to you in presenting you to him, I present you your own self. Leonard Jefferies, you try to figure him out.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferies.
And his assistant, Stefan.
Okay, brothers and sisters. I'm certainly glad to see you over here in this warm weather when you know you could be doing a whole lot of other things. And I want to thank our brother and his family. And in the old days, it was Brother Stedman. Now that's, many of you all, that's way past your time. Brother Zanuni has a background, and we all have. In other words, you know me as Dr. Leonard Jefferies Jr., born right here on Central Avenue, and having raised up in these communities here in Newark and East Orange. But my African stool name that has been officially given to me by the Africans in Ghana is Nana, which is the title that the elders, male and female, get. But Kwakujwa Ajiman II. And that's from the Ashanti Agogo stool. And so if you hear that somebody named Dr. Leonard Jefferies has kind of chilled out and you don't hear much about him, but then all of a sudden here comes this new dude on the block. Nana Kwakujwa Ajiman II. He's raising all kinds of hell and raising up Shekinah up and holding up Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark. Then you know it's the same brother with the same African consciousness doing what he has done. Now, my wife is absolutely correct. I try to do in this last 24 hours about 10 things. And one thing I blew, and when I realized that that brother was here making his fantastic presentation, I should have jumped right back into my car and spent 5 minutes to go over to East Orange and Prospect and pick up my mother and bring her back here. Because she's waiting for me since I came from Atlanta. This afternoon I called her and told her I would come and pick her up at 4, 5 o'clock. That's the one thing I didn't do of the 1,500 things I had planned to do. What I did do when I dropped my wife here was to run off to Newark, around the corner from Ken Travis, to meet with my partners that I grew up with on 14th Street, 12th Street, and 13th Street in Newark. And just to let them know that I'm confirmed for the big event, October the 12th. We hope you can put that on your calendar. We'll be having a major presentation at the Robert Treat Hotel in Newark. And what we will be celebrating is that community I grew up in. My wife says she hasn't been able to quite figure me out yet, and I'm trying to figure myself out. But I know that those youngsters I grew up with, 14th Street here in Newark, between 9th Avenue and Gould Avenue, of the 20 kids I grew up with, 18 of us made it big. And we made it big because that was a community. That was an African community. We didn't call it African. African wasn't a major term that we used to express ourselves. But those were black people who were African conscious. They operate with the African value system of the 3 C's: communal, cooperative, and collective spiritual development. And so all of us considered each other as brothers and sisters. All the adults were considered aunts or uncles. Even today, we're not quite sure who was really a blood aunt and a blood uncle. All the elders were respected. And that business that they say, if you did something wrong, you had to expect to get banned 3 or 4 times, because if a neighbor found you doing something wrong, they'd grab you by the collar and take care of business right out in the street without even being embarrassed, then drag you home. If your mama was there, she'd take care of business, and then you'd have to expect a third happening when your father came home. And so that was the type of accountability we had and responsibility to each other. Help Presley and his sister in and help raise them as their own. We have to be able to see that this was what has gotten us this far. But as the European moved in heavy over the last 30, 40 years and told us you got to integrate. That's right. And you're not correct unless you're with some European somewhere out in the hills in the suburbs. And we're not integrating with each other, which is the foundation for what we need to build upon if we're going to do anything serious. And so we've got to recapture that. 13th Street, 14th Street, and 12th Street was an African community, and we took care of each other. So they're meeting now at Sonny Catino, my cousin's house, and Sonny was born January 26th. I was born January 19th. And the big question was who would come out first. Both our mothers were carrying us on 14th Street, and I kicked out, pushed out early. But I wasn't anxious to get out here because somehow intuitively I knew that this shit was heavy out here, and I wasn't anxious to come out. But they had to actually pull me out, you know, with those little forceps, etc., because I knew that there was a mess out here that we had to deal with. And so, but I finally got out here, and I've been kicking butt ever since. I've been living by that whole premise of if there is no struggle, there is no progress. And you ought to be shocked. Huh? You ought to be shocked. How did you get over here by yourself? Someone did bring you? Oh, that's beautiful. The sister told me she was going to try to make it over here. I was trying to explain exactly where it was. She said she needed the exact location. I gave her just about where I thought it was. You know, and here she is. Let's acknowledge this African queen that is coming on. And I spoke in New York at St. Peter's. Sister Karen Mason was trying to get us to make the music work on our behalf. She's organized a group called Africans in Music, and she has a lecture series that has been taking place at a white church down on 54th Street and Lexington Avenue. And we had a very nice session there on Friday, and the sister was there. I learned from Karen today when I picked up my voice mail when I came in from Atlanta and rushed to the office that the series will be now moving to 125th Street at the RKO Victoria 5. And so she asked me if I would be available at the end of July 22nd or July 30th. We come back from Africa around the 15th of July. We're leaving this Saturday. And those of you who didn't have sense enough to get your money together, clear off your credit cards, you'll be missing another opportunity to go to Africa with Dr. J and get the real deal. I know most of you, some of you have been with other folks, but you know, you don't get the real deal unless you go with Dr. J. Isn't that right? Now, the Timmons are right there to let you all know. They went with us and their son. If you really want to get exposed to the culture in a couple of weeks and to the history in a couple of weeks, then you have to be with people who have made it a part of their life. My wife started going before I even met her. I had nerve enough to go to Africa before I even gave her permission. That was, you know, 1960 in the summer. Before Nigeria became independent, she was in the rainforest of Nigeria at a little place called Ehamufu, which later became the center where they built Nsukka, the major university in the eastern part of Nigeria. And then I went in 61 to the Ivory Coast, and then 62 to Senegal, then 63 to Guinea, and then 64 I was coordinating all of West Africa, and then 65, 66, my wife and I got married in 64, and then we went to Africa to live for a couple of years. And so this foundation, this African experience, at the time that African nationhood was being born, we were right there. we were right there tasting it and gobbling it up. And it's not going to happen again. If you all weren't there at that time, you just missed it. I know, Brother OJ, you wasn't even born, so you just missed it, brother. You missed Sekou Touré trying to take Guinea and deal with Guinea and had nothing to go with, because the French had pulled everything out, including the telephone books, including the school records, and he tried to structure a nation with nothing. And Kwame Nkrumah was dreaming of a great African union of African peoples everywhere, not just Ghana. And he was going to use Ghana as the base, and his Pan-African dreams were being projected when he was touching base with Marcus Garvey's spirit while in this country in the late 30s and 40s. He was a student at Lincoln and met the spirit of Marcus Garvey. And so 1945, at the Manchester Conference, a number of important Africans like Kwame Nkrumah were dreaming of an independence Africa. Now picture yourself at a conference with as many people as we have in this room, or not many more than that. And at that conference, after the European system had collapsed in on itself with those white-on-white wars that the Europeans have every few years, destroying tens of millions of people, they were planning in 1945 to reconstitute their system of imperialism and domination. So they were meeting in San Francisco and establishing the United Nations. And they were meeting later and establishing NATO. And they were meeting later and establishing the Marshall Plan. Europeans trying to reconstitute their system capability to dominate peoples of color. But in 1945, Africans were meeting in Manchester, and they were saying it's going to be a new ball game. They come under the aegis of all people, W.E.B. Du Bois, who called for the conference, one of the Pan-African conferences he had participated in. But who was there? George Padmore, up from Trinidad, a Pan-Africanist who wrote a fantastic book called Pan-Africanism or Communism. You will need to have a copy of it. You need to study it. Pan-African Communism by George Padmore, and Padmore became one of the partners for Nkrumah. But in 1945, there was no Ghana that they could go back to. It was the Gold Coast colony under Britain. 1945, there was no African independence movement. There were just two independent nations, semi-independent. Liberia, a semi-colony of America, and Ethiopia just coming out of the yoke of the Italian occupation. So for Africans to be together in Manchester dreaming of an independence movement, that was an extraordinary thing, especially when the Europeans were trying to get themselves together again to control and dominate, using the might of the atomic bomb and all those things that they had created out of their war-destructive processes. Who was there with Nkrumah and with W.E.B. Du Bois and Padmore? Jomo Kenyatta, who was dreaming of taking back Kenya for Africans. And not only did he participate in that process, but he joined with others who were dreaming of the same thing, and the Mau Mau movement was born in the 50s, with Africans saying that they're going to take back the white highlands. Now, Europeans got to Africa, found a selective place in Kenya, and called it the White Highlands. That means white people's land. So Africans got together and said, we're going to take it back. They swore oaths to die. They swore oaths to kill. And many Africans were killed because many Africans were not prepared to let Africans take back the land. They're ready to stand and let the Europeans keep the land. So in order to get at the Europeans, you had to remove some Africans. We need to learn the lesson of the Mau Maus. That's a lesson that's right there for you to learn and to look at and to appreciate. Who was there with Padmore and with Nkrumah and with W.B. Du Bois? Ross McConnell, a brother from Ethiopia. And he had a restaurant. And one of the things that he did with his restaurant, the chair is broken, brother. You need to grab one of the other chairs. My nephew was sitting in it and I realized it. But he was light, he could handle it. But Ross McConnell had a restaurant and he did a lot of feeding of the group. They would meet at his restaurant. Nobody ever went hungry because if you didn't have money to pay for some food, you could always go to Ross McConnell's restaurant and you could get the knowledge in nourishment and you could get the food in nourishment. And who was there? Paul Robeson, one of the tallest tree in our forest. Robeson grew up right up here in Madison, New Jersey, and whose family was lodged in Harlem. Mother Zion AME Church is the Robeson Church. And when they made Paul Robeson a non-person, a few years after the Manchester process, they rendered Paul Robeson a communist, and a non-person took his passport, tried to prevent his career from flowering, but his family church allowed him to give his concerts and whatnot in that beautiful Mother Zion Church, in which generations of Robesons have come out. Who was there? Many other Africans who were dreaming of an independent Africa. Now look at this. Africa was under the yoke and the domination of the Europeans. How could a handful of brothers and and sisters dream that they could go up against this thing when it wasn't realistic. They didn't have no capability of doing what they did. You have to put yourself in their position. Jomo Kenyatta may have thought of taking back the White Highlands, but the British still had military forces, colonial armies, in Kenya. And it wasn't going to be an easy chore. And Nkrumah hadn't been back to Ghana. In fact, he had to be invited back by some other movement of Ghanaians, and then he took over the movement and then pushed the movement beyond where they had intended it to go. But you have to understand that we have people who believe in this process that I talked about. There was a newspaper article that was written a couple of years ago, and the article, when I spoke at 1993, I spoke in England at a Pan-African conference, and I came up with what Africans can conceive, Africans can achieve. And the brother wrote this up in the English paper, and then somebody in the United States republished it. But what Africans can conceive, they can achieve. That is what we've got to begin to appreciate and understand. 1945, Africans conceived of independence and put it in place, while the powers that be were conceiving of recolonizing Africa. But a revolutionary movement was already in works. They had armed the colonial African forces to fight for the European. And then these same colonial forces became part of the revolutionary struggle. Many thousands of Africans went to fight to save France. They had done it in World War II. World War I, France brought them back for World War II. But these brothers wasn't going back under the colonial yoke the way it previously had been. The way the European works, he arms people from the Caribbean, puts them in West Indian regiments to go over to Africa to suppress Africans. But many of these brothers began to see the contradictions, and so they were prepared to start revolutionary movements in the Caribbean, or to stay in Africa and fight with the Africans. Padmore did that. Others did that. So we need to look at this history with serious analytical tools. And so I'm glad that now that they've wiped out the Black Studies Department, they have forced me into the Political Science Department. So we're going to blacken it up. I'm going back to my old political science analysis. That's where I started, in the Political Science Department. And when I announced that to the Board of Trustees, because when they were wiping out, they were meeting to wipe out the Black Studies and all the, I went before them and I held up my full African robe now, I held out my arms. And I said, this is Dr. Leonard Jefferies, Jr., PhD from Columbia University, your greatest nightmare. And it's the first time I had a chance to deal with these Board of Trustees. You know, we were locked in this enormous fight that went up to the Supreme Court twice. This is the first time I had a chance to look at them, and they had a chance to look at me. It was psychological warfare. And I said, if you have the courage to do what you should do as white supremacists, you would get rid of me and not destroy these departments that all these students, and there were a whole lot of students and faculty there, need to have to benefit from. In order to get at me, they're wiping out Jewish studies, Asian studies, Latin American studies, and black studies. Already voted it out. It's gone. You know? But we're still there because we got tenure. Political Science Department says they don't want me in there. He's anti-white, anti-Semitic. You better believe I'm anti-white. If I was not, be crazy. You better believe that I'm anti-white. If I was not, be crazy. And I got plenty of reason to be anti-Jewish too. I got plenty of reason to be anti-Jewish. You want me to start? We'd be here all night. I don't know about Semitism because most European Jews are not Semitic peoples. They use the Semitic foundation to claim power and place and space. As Dr. Wade Noble says, power is the ability to define reality and have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. And when you can define yourself as Semitic peoples, then you can claim the biblical heritage. But in reality, European Jews speaking Yiddish and German and Austrian and everything else and Russian and Polish are not Semitic peoples. Most peoples who are Semitic, and that refers to a language, are people of color. And I'm not. I am not anti-people of color. But I got plenty of reason to be anti-white and anti-Jewish. And I'm not anti-white or anti-Jewish, but I have a systems analysis which I've been able to develop over the years, and when I apply that systems analysis, it shows me the realities, it shows me the contradictions. And as I was outlining to you this enormous 50-year turning point of history that we are now in, it's a revolutionary turning point of history. And you're a part of that consciousness in this center that was formed by a brother and his family to try to get you every week or so to be listening to some of us to lay down what is happening. We're in a revolutionary period of African consciousness. In spite of all the contradictions, all the problems that you see, it is happening. This is like 150 years ago. If we was on one plantation down in the Caribbean or a plantation in the south of these United States, and there was a group of us meeting off in the woods, and we've been meeting every time we can get away to plot and plan how we're going to liberate ourselves, how we're going to kill the master when we get the first opportunity, or we're going to snuff out the life of the overseer, etc. We may not be able to do it, but at least we was getting together to talk about it. So when the happenings could happen, we would be ready to take on. But of course, most of our people was up there getting the bale of cotton and cutting the cane. But some of us was in the backwoods plotting and planning, getting ready for the event to happen. Because revolution is here. European system will collapse in and on itself. It will collapse from contradictions and decay. It will collapse because the European plans to control the world with an alliance with Asians. And what the European does not know, Asians don't like white people. Let me put that in the camera. Asians don't like white people. You ain't going to get the Chinese to be loving white folks. They may let a few McDonald's hamburgers come in and some Pepsi Cola. But the Chinese people see themselves as having a mandate from heaven. They are the center of the human family, and there's no way you're going to change that belief in the Chinese. It's in their culture. It don't make any difference whether they are Maoists or communists or Marxists or Leninists. Chinese culture dictates how they think about themselves. And you better start mastering that and understanding that. Move away from the ideological traps that people have you in. And the Chinese people ain't going to be hooking up with the Japanese either. They got a hurting for the Japanese. We don't know when it's going to happen, but they got a hurting for the Japanese. And when the 2 billion Chinese get themselves together, one of the first hurtings is going to be the Japanese. You see? And they ain't going to forget. And it's going to be like what the Jewish people say, never again. Chinese say never, 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 never again. Or they're going to be submitted to the atrocities that the Japanese visited upon them. And you have to understand that. And the Chinese don't like white. They don't like white communists. The biggest army in the history of the world was put together not to face down the Japanese. I tell you, they're their traditional rivals and enemies. The biggest army was not facing south to deal with the Vietnamese and the American troops. The biggest army in the history of the world was put along the Sino-Russian border, the border between China and Russia. 3 to 4 million Chinese armed to take on white Russians was there. And these are communist sisters and brothers. Workers of the world, unite. But Chinese culture said white racism dominates. It don't make any difference how much Marxism and Lenin is preached. White racism dominates. And Mother Russia dominates the Soviet Union. So even though they call it the Union of Soviet Republics, it was dominated by Mother White Russia. You've got to deal with race as a factor in analysis. Race and class go together. You can't say one is important and the other is not. We have to see them as tandems in terms of the same process. And as we master these analyses, things will become clearer to us. White world thinks they're going to be able to work with the Asians. No. Asians going to try to dominate them. And when they go through their wars, we better be prepared to find some independence in between these two monsters. Indians ain't got no love for the Europeans. You know, they got their own little Hindu beliefs. And they think they're superior to everybody. That's why the poor people down in Trinidad and Guyana is having such a hard time. You know, they thought that Walter Rodden was trying to work with everybody, all the workers, get the workers together. The Indian workers along with the black workers. And the Indians said, let's go for it. Because they knew that Hindu culture would dictate that they operate differently. They may be Marxists, so they'll work with the black Marxists, and they maybe for labor and they'll work with the black workers. But when it comes to their culture tells them what to do, where, how, and when. And And that's what we're missing, the cultural component. Negroes, how many Negroes here are from Trinidad and Tobago? Come on, don't be embarrassed. Put up your hands. Put up your hands. You know, we went down to Trinidad to open up Emancipation Day, August the 1st. Fantastic. Because there's a group of African in Trinidad and Tobago that's trying to raise the consciousness. And that's why they asked myself, Brother Small, Professor Scobie, Tony Martin, and Dr. Clark, and Dr. Ben, and all of us to come down periodically. But you got some brothers down there who honestly believe that they're a multiracial society, that they're not black, and they're certainly not African. And unfortunately, one of them was the Prime Minister, Manning. Good-looking black man, walked tall, proud, good education, okay? And had a beautiful wife, darker than him, tall, prominent black woman, holding herself with grace and dignity. But both these Negroes wasn't black. Both of them wasn't black. And they carry that mess on from Eric Williams. Eric Williams, Manley, and all of them said, we multiracial. So ain't nothing multiracial about Jamaica. Jamaica is 95% black. Those 2 or 3 other people you got, they're just there. You don't redefine your whole circumstance because you got 2 or 3 other people there. Multiracial society. Those islands are black because they were inundated by Africans during the enslavement period. And Guyana and Trinidad became brown to a certain extent because the English reached into India, southern India, and brought in laboring masses to work where African peoples wouldn't work the plantations anymore. So we need to understand this history. But Indian culture has dictated that those Indians work with Indians. Now people in Trinidad who had jobs for 20 years is losing their jobs. Every day I pick up a paper reading about the island, the Twin Island community, Trinidad and Tobago. They're losing their... Trinidad is an African island. But you better believe that within 5 years the Indians will have it. Do you understand what I'm saying? That they're moving in on Trinidad. And don't take my word for it. Let's go to the videotape. You know? Deep down in this bag somewhere. I got your book. What is it called? Tribes. This is the book that you're all going to have to get. Tribes. If you're going to have a serious analysis on what's happening, you got to have tribes. And they got copies over there. I got copies here. Wherever I go, I'm carrying tribes. You know how I carry Diep's book around all over the world? I'm carrying tribes now. How race, religion, identity determine success in the new global economy. Joel Kotkin, K-O-T-K-I-N, a Jewish fellow. When I raise questions about Jews, I always cite Jewish scholarship. You've got to. And then that clarifies the air, except that you're not supposed to cite Jewish scholarship because you're not supposed to have a critical faculty to do it. But Joel Kotkin cites as the model of the new tribe the Jews 500 years ago who pulled themselves together after centuries of oppression in Europe. They became the model of how financial elites dominate and control the world. He wrote it. The first model is the Jewish model. The making of global tribes is chapter 1. Chapter 2 is the secret of the Jews. And see, that's why I've been in a little bit of trouble because I've been in the middle of the secret. I grew up with Jews. Michael Jacobson was my little buddy on the streets of Newark. Went to Barrington High School with Italian, Jews, and Irish. Then went on to college. And then became a member of the Jewish fraternity, not the Alpha Phi Alphas, or the Mega Psi Phis, or the Kappa Budai, and the Boule, and all the rest of that. I was in the Jewish fraternity. And then black power always rises to the top if it's properly nourished and nurtured, and I became the president of the fraternity. The president was called the Rex, so in reality, I was the king of the Jews in college. You know, I mean, that's it. They call me Rex. Rex Jefferies. Rex Len. You know. But the beautiful thing was, I'm in there studying the process, the system, how they operate. Jews didn't necessarily like each other. I had to coordinate over 100 Jews. But they were going to work with each other against the outside. So we won a scholarship trophy 14 semesters in a row. Why? Because not because we were smarter. We had a system. We had a system. Black fraternities got step dancing. Jewish fraternities got a system. And when I became the president, we moved from an old wooden clapperboard house into a mansion off campus. So I had to direct the development and the redevelopment of this mansion. So I was in on all the planning. And on the first floor of the new place, we had the living room and the dining room. For the brothers upstairs, we had the bedrooms. Downstairs, we had the rec room. In one part of the basement, another part of the basement, we had the library. In the library, we had the file room. In the file room, we had all of the records and files of all of the teachers on the campus. If Professor Staplefoot, head of biology, was on the campus 15 years, we had 15 years of Professor Staplefoot's exams, 15 years of Professor Staplefoot's courses, 15 years of how Professor Staplefoot changed his exam questions from year to year to fool the students. You can't lose with the stuff Jews use. Reverend Ike picked that up. Even dumb Jews made it well. Al Koretsky, the basketball star, my buddy was big, husky, black brother from Dan. You see me try to flex my muscles sometimes. Dan was the football star, okay? The football star. Dan is a medical doctor, surgeon, UCLA Medical School, Charles Drew Medical Hospital, King Hospital in Los Angeles. You don't get football stars going on to become medical doctors. But if there's a system that allows them to master the knowledge and have support, they can do it. So I'm telling you, I learned from that. And because I've been in the middle, I understand the secret of the Jews. Now what you're going to have to get out of me is to try to get me to publish it. But it ain't going to go cheap. You're going to have to put together some serious money for me to publish The Secret of the Jews. I'm not going to publish that without some support. Because you can get killed putting out The Secret of the Jews. But this brother has laid out a little bit of it. And I try to lay it out for you. Stefan, where's my... right here. I try to lay it out for you as Dr. Diop and others have helped me lay it out in reference to that Jefferies formula of the pyramid, where we talk about linking the three elements: economics, politics, and culture. If you want to have a system capability, if Brother Nooney and his leadership wants to do anything with you and weld you all together, it's got to be a formula that involves economics, politics, and culture. And no one aspect of the formula is going to get you over. All three have to be coordinated. Economics is your productive capability, your creative capability. Every living thing has to have an economic dimension. You have to master that. Every cell in your body has to be a productive economic phenomenon, otherwise it dies. And if too many cells in your body die, you got cancer and something else and you're out of here. Every cell in your body has to be productive, so it joins the other cells to form the various units and systems of your body. The breathing system, the digestive system, the extractive system, the blood system, circulation. In other words, you are made up of a series of systems that go back to the basic unit of a cell that has to be a living organism that is productive. So we as a sociological phenomenon have to be a family that's productive. And in your family productivity, if it's going to work for you, it has to be managed. Management is politics. Politics and economics go together. Economics being your creative base and politics being your management capability. Politics is not what the Mayor Sharp James does. Right. Politics is what you do to manage your life, what you do to manage your family, what you do to manage your organization, what you do to manage your communities, what we do to manage our universe, as my wife said. We've been given all of these things because we are the foundation people. We have the mother continent. We have the globe. What are we doing with the management of that? Not very much, because we don't even manage our own lives. So we got to go back to basics, making sure that everything that we do is economically productive and making sure that what we do has a serious understanding of politics. We're told to stay away from politics except come to the election to vote for somebody else that they done selected to be your leader. We're told to don't become involved in economics. Too complicated. Just work hard and bring your money to the other folks who'll take care of it. My Jewish people have mastered. That's one of the secrets of the Jews. To make sure black folks don't understand what is economics and politics. And the Jews say, you just become productive and then bring the productivity to us. Right. We'll take care of you, make sure that you eat, have food, clothing, and shelter. But we'll take the excess of your productivity and put it in our larger system to make sure we rise to the top. You need to study the relationship of blacks and Jews, not a civil rights relationship. You need to study the economic relationship. You need to study the whole housing market, from the Wheat Break section in Newark where they used to be, all up into Hillside, up into South Orange and Maplewood, etc. You need to study the turnover of housing and how this whole process was done. I started studying that in 1958-59 as a young kid, 21, 22 years old at Lafayette College. And the document I wrote was 150 pages, called The Urban Crisis. That's what I did as my honors work as a young graduate student. You can't get students to do nothing like that today. You ask them to do a term paper of 20 pages. They will say, that's too much. I don't do the 20 pages. My introduction was 7 pages. The bibliography was 7 to 10 pages. And then the research was hands-on research in between, traveling all the cities in Newark and Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, Washington, Cleveland, Akron, Detroit, going all the way out to California, St. Louis, Kansas City. This is what I did as a young kid, knowing I had to have my own black studies program because at Lafayette College there wasn't nothing black. So I devised my own program. So this is one of the documents we're going to revise and publish in the new work that we're putting together dealing with the making of the scholar warrior. That's the second book. The first book we got to come out has to deal with the more recent crisis of the making of the curriculum of inclusion and all of that struggle that went on that. But economics, politics, and culture is your foundation. Our brother can't do anything without it. Brother Anuni. Dr. Ben can't survive because he's never put it in place the way it should be. So he's floundering. Dr. Clark has a little more stability, but not enough to really carry on his work. Do you understand that we were blessed to have 2 pillars in our community, Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark, and there's nothing in place to help them carry on their work? And you cannot say that you were not forewarned because you had a great brother, Chancellor Williams, who was not taken care of in his old age by the community that worships him today. You had a brother, Amos Wilson, who just passed here a couple of years ago. None of us are inquiring what's happening to his latest work. It was supposed to be 85% finished. Have any of us raised any money to make sure the brothers who are working on it get it done? Amos died of heavy stress because of lack of support. Amos was a lone wolf. Didn't even have a strong family connection. And that's the blessing that I have. Secret of the Jews is to have family connections. And I got worldwide family connections. That's why I'm here now. I got biological family connections. That's why before I got here to you, I rushed to 14th Street, the people meeting who I grew up with, to let them know we are still one. I'll be there. It was more important for me to get to them. That's why I dropped my wife off. She didn't know what I was doing. You know? I said, you got to hold this down and tell them you be the hostage while I'm going and at least let my people know, you know. And that's serious. This just happened. I got an extended family. These are kids we grew up with 59 years ago. We still see and love each other. Bobby Robinson was there and we were talking about how in the football huddle in Barringer, these Italians would be playing East Orange, all black. Barringer was mainly Italians, and they'd be in the huddle. Let's get the niggas, let's get that black people. Not you, Bobby, not you, Lenny. We had to live with that. We had to live with that. And you know who I was rooting for? I was rooting for East Orange. East Orange was kicking butt in the old days. They used to have the Statue of Liberty plays and all kinds of mess that they was carrying on, the Thomas brothers in the old days. But that welded us together as Africans. Dr. Spellman, Robert Spellman, lived right across the street from me. His mother and father, when they got married, my mother and father stood with them. He wound up going to Africa in '64 with the Crossroads Africa program, same program my wife and I was involved in. Percy Oliver, basketball star, but a teacher. His sister Nancy, teacher. And a few years ago, she invited me to a church up in Bloomfield or Nutley. I forgot one of those communities up there where we used to not go because those were all Italian communities in those days. But Nancy had that whole church wearing kente cloth. Choir, everybody wearing kente cloth on that occasion. Sammy Foster, Dr. Sammy Foster, became a principal of a Newark school. He was head of Quitman Street School, at the time the largest public school in New Jersey. He's now down in Silver Springs. So you got Presley Woods and the Olivers, and you got the Fosters, and you got the Jenkins, and you got Duke Hawes and his brothers. You got all of us that came out of that one little block. The Spellmans, the Catinos, the Jefferies. And that's why we are what we are. We had this foundation, this sense of consciousness. We had a sense of working together. Because when our families didn't have jobs, when families got a job somewhere, the first person to get a job would be your neighbor. It wasn't a question of competing with the Joneses. It was the blacks helping each other. If you got a job at the General Electric or you got a job at Ronson Lighters, and an opening came up, you were the first to come home and tell your neighbors. And then they got a job. We never had to worry about jobs in Newark. Men had 2 or 3 jobs when the factories were there to have jobs. People don't have jobs now because the factories are not there. They went down south, and then the international system with the tribes control took them to Asia. You have to have a systems analysis. Now, the people who got money in the war effort, remember I was starting to talk about 1945 and the restructuring of these systems? We put a lot of money in Korea. That's why South Korea is prosperous. American military money went in to make Korea a success to prove that it was better than communist Korea. So now the Koreans are coming back with that money, taking over our communities. As organized peoples, economics and politics is their foundation, and culture tells them what to do with each other. Here's where we're in trouble. Culture, we have not made a major factor in our equation. And even though we may be Baptists and Methodists and Pentecostals, we may be Yorubas and Akans, etc., we have not made this question of African culture our reality. We've all fallen back on a little piece of it and claimed that that is the truth, and you can't relate to any of it. Same as the way the little folks come from the islands with those little island mentalities. I don't want nobody coming from the island with this little island mentality. I want Marcus Garveys. Let me have some Marcus Garveys. Ain't nobody in Jamaica better than nobody else. Ain't nobody in no little island called Nevis, St. Kitts, Montserrat, St. Croix better than anybody else. Antigua, a good hurricane, wipe all those islands out. That ain't nothing to be hanging on to. You got a mother continent, the mother continent of the universe. We were dispersed to these islands, into South Carolina and Georgia and Virginia. Ain't nothing special because you come up from South Carolina, you better than the people from North Carolina. Are you from Virginia, you better than the people from Georgia? That's the cultural game that they have us in. Brazil has 100+ million black people. They're all divided into 30 races because the European has put in place his domination, and his domination says the Europeans remain unified even though they come from Poland, they come from Russia, they come from Germany, they come from Italy, they come from France. They are unified, and the blacks are divided up into races based upon size of nose, size of lips, texture of hair, and skin colors. So the 100 million Brazilians can't get together. There's a book called Black Labor, White Wealth that you should have by Claude Anderson as you put your analysis together. And that you'll be able to see that Brazil's great wealth comes from the black labor. But black people are not able to benefit from the wealth because they do not manage it. There's no political leadership, black political leadership in Brazil. When the black woman Benedita de Souza was about to become the mayor of Rio, one of the greatest cities in the world, white folks got together and said she will not get it no matter what. They created all kinds of lies, newspaper editorials calling her monkey and everything else. So this black woman Benedita de Souza did not get it, but when I went down to Brazil in '92 to try to lift her spirit, she lifted ours. She said, I'm still going to fight no matter what. I'm still a congresswoman. I still have my base. Even though she almost became the first black woman to head a major city in the world. But the politics is not in our control. And even if it was in our control, we don't have what I call the VIP to make it work for us. VIP is what your culture dictates to you. VIP is not very important person. That's what most of us think we are when we get a hold of something. I'm from Guyana, I'm something. Unless you operate in the spirit of Walter Rodney, you ain't but so much. whether you come from Guyana or not. In other words, we think we're very important persons. I got a degree from Columbia. It don't mean a damn thing. In fact, it means you need to be seriously checked out because they might have your butt locked up and you may become one of the biggest exploiters of our people. But it determines what you do with your VIP, your values, your interests, and your principles. We want to have African values that speak to our heart. But you got to study just what they are. That's why Sheikh Anta Diop is so important, because he deals with economics, politics, and culture. And he says we got to put together the systems to make that work. He says there's a cultural unity of Africa. That's a formula that you need to understand. There's diversity and unity in Africa. That you need to see the conceptual frameworks of Africa and not see the divisions. You see the tradition of circumcision for males as part of the manhood educational process, but don't worry about how each individual group cuts the penis to make the circumcision work. And then get into a fight that the Yoruba do it better than the Akan and the Bakongo do it better than the Antebelli. That's what we get caught up in when we get into the European mode. But the concept of males and females and complementarity, the concept of the centrality of the female, concept of an African family that is a living family of 3 dimensions, an extended living family, an extended ancestral family, an extended family of people yet to be born. You can't have the European nuclear family as your concept of family. That's why tribes are so successful, because they operate on another family formula. And what this brother is saying, you had the Jews who laid down the model, you had the British that followed them, you had other groups that took up their mode, and now you have overseas Chinese and overseas Indians. Trinidad and Guyana are being taken over by the overseas Indians, not just the local Indians. It is wealth coming from India that's influencing what the local Indian population in Trinidad and Tobago is doing. The president of India doesn't leave India just to come for a vacation in the sun in Trinidad. He came to sign the secret documents in terms of Indian wealth going to the Indian population in Trinidad. And they were finally successful in taking over politically in Trinidad to match their economic control and influence. And unfortunately, it was the black brothers from Tobago that gave them the final coup, because the African family had not been at work. And Manning and the rest of them had dissed Robinson. So when it came to Robinson trying to decide who's going to be the prime minister, the Indian or Robinson, because they hadn't had an African family connection, even agreeing to disagree but not be disagreeable, Robinson voted Manning out by joining the Indians. That's the Trinidad situation. So you've got to begin to have this systems analysis. It's interesting that the brother, and I'm going to call him up, I've talked to him on the phone. As you know, Gary Bird had me standing in for him a couple of weeks ago. And I'm going to call him and find out why did he leave out the Dutch. The Jews become the model prototype of the financial elite, but the Dutch follow them, not the English. Amsterdam becomes the leading financial center between 1650 and 1750. England takes over after that. The model for establishing these financial elite institutions are things such as the trading companies like the Dutch West Indian Company. And then after the Dutch West Indian Company was set up with the help of the Dutch Protestants and the Jews, in 1937 they helped the Danes set up the Danish Guinea Company. In 1949 they helped the Swedes set up the Swedish West African Company. In the 1950s, the Jews wrote a letter to Cromwell in England to say, we want to come back into England. The Jews have been kicked out since 1290. 1290, the Jews were out of England. They hadn't been in there for hundreds of years. A letter has been written by Rabbi Menachem ben Israel asking Cromwell, the revolutionary leader of England, if the Jews can now come in. This is 1655. And shortly thereafter, the Jews start to come in. By 1661, the English are setting up what? Their Royal African companies to deal with. All these trading companies are government institutions. They're war machines. They're economics, politics, and culture. All of them are dealing with slavery. The settlement of the West Indies in the so-called West Indies in the 1600s comes as a result of trading companies. Jews were major partners. Jews said systematize the process. Europeans have been involved in thuggishness. You remember what I say what the European value system is? Domination, destruction, and death? That comes out of the caveman value system of the Europeans. The Greeks had perfected it. The Romans had perfected it. Then they had a chaos for 1,000 years. Fall of the Roman Empire, 400 or so AD. And then until 1400 AD, the Europeans didn't put themselves together. There's a 1,000-year hiatus of Europeans fighting each other, the Viking raids, the Crusades, and all kinds of other mess. So when the Jews, who had been the financial elite of the Spanish monarchy and the Portuguese, because they had been financial major players when Spain was Muslim, they were the grandees in the Iberian Peninsula. Grandees mean they're the people helping to manage what? Economics, politics, and culture. Okay? And so when the Spanish, having reconquered Spain with Jewish help, decided to throw the Jews out. See, that's 1492. You've got to have an analysis of 1492. Most of us learned 1492 Columbus. But 1492 has to be seen in this tripartite Jefferies triangular process. 1492, January, is the fall of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold. The reconquest of Spain has finally taken place by the Catholics after 800 years of African Arab Moorish domination. January 1492 has to be clocked in. Then while the Spanish white Catholics get control, they now tell the white Jews, Sephardic Jews, that you have to be out of Spain by August. And they decree that in March 1492. So at the same time you see the victory over the Muslims, you have to see the Jews being victimized by the Catholics in March 1492. Now during that time, March 1492, Columbus got a hearing with the Queen of Spain. And who allowed the hearing to take place? The Sephardic Jewish community. Why? Because they knew they had to get out. They had to finance these voyages so they could find maybe there's some connections in the East that they can slip out. Now some of these Jews are Catholics, but they're called New Christians, Morenos. You see them playing both sides of the game, inside and outside. Some Jews remaining Jews, some converting and becoming Catholics. But the Jews had to finance Columbus because they needed to find a way out. Where they're going to go? Spain is kicking them out. They had a golden age in Spain. So before you can see October, Columbus and his ship sailed in August, you've got to see the Muslim victory and you have to see the Jewish expulsion. And the wealth from the Jewish expulsion being used to finance some of the activities of the Spanish throne. But it was wealthy Jews who had converted to Catholicism, Sant'Angelo and others, who controlled the wealth of Aragon and Castile that financed Columbus. But that's not in the history books, but it's got to be in your book. It's not in tribes, but you better start understanding it. Because you have to see the role of this financial elite, referred to as the Jewish tribe, and how it moved from place to place after it was persecuted and reestablished itself. If somebody invited them in, like the Dutch, were fighting for independence from the Spaniards, from the 1580s. And so the Dutch were looking for partners. And so the Dutch made sure that Amsterdam was a place where the Jews were the freest in Europe. Why? Because you think the Dutch liked the Jews? No, they wanted that money, they wanted that system of relationship to come into Amsterdam, and it did by the 1600s. And from that point on, Amsterdam took off and became the leading center of European development. This is a book by Jonathan Israel, European Jewry in the Age of Mercantilism, 1550 to 1750. Now when we learn about the Dutch in the school, we learn about them being wood shoe wearing, tulip growing, and windmill pushing. Had nothing to do with Dutch. The Dutch were serious traders, merchants, and financiers. And once they linked up with the Jews, they became the dynamo of Europe. They moved the center of European economic development from Spain and Portugal and Italy to Northern Europe, to Amsterdam, to Rotterdam, to Hamburg in Germany. And by 1655, the Jews are saying to Cromwell, we can bring you some shit in England if you act right. No, that's what it is. You got to know that letter. All black people should know the letter that's in. Jews are proud of it, but you got to see behind it. It was saying, the Jews were saying, let us in. We'll help you compete with the Dutch. You don't forever need to be behind the Dutch. We can help you compete with the Dutch. And so they did. And by the end of that century, by 1690-something, they were forming what? The Bank of England. Only a few Jews in England, but the English gave 100 seats to Anglicans in the Bank of England, 12 to non-Anglican Christians, and 12 seats to Jews. That's an inordinate power in the Bank of England. You only got a few hundred people in England and they're giving you 12 seats? Okay. That shows what? Financial clout. That's why they're so upset when in the Albany speech I mentioned that rich Jews participated in the development and the financing of the slave trade. They were key players because they had the international connections. They had their converted Christian brothers in Spain and Portugal, and they were controlling what? The asientos. What is the asiento? The contract to take Africans to the Spanish New World. Spain had no places where the slaves came from, Africans and slaves came from. Portugal controlled that. But then when Portugal broke from Spain, there was a big problem. Because Portugal used to supply Spain. In other words, Portugal was under the Spanish monarchy. The Netherlands was under the Spanish monarchy. Holland was under the Spanish monarchy. Holland broke and became independent. Then Portugal broke and became independent in 1640. So where were the Spanish going to get the enslaved peoples to work the mines and to work the plantations in Cuba and Santo Domingo and other places, and Colombia? But by then, the Jews had been colonizing the Caribbean. They had been sending out groups of Jews to go to the Caribbean to start plantation economies because they could not take the overload of Jews coming into Amsterdam. That's the one thing the Protestants said, you can come, but don't bring your poor. And if you bring some poor, you got to take care of them. And after the 30 Years' War, when a lot of poor Jews were being beat up in Poland and Germany, they started moving toward Amsterdam. And then when Brazil was lost, when Brazil got its army together, Portugal got its army together and took Brazil back. So 1654, the Dutch and their Jewish partners lost that gem of Brazil, Recife, Pernambuco, where they were producing all that sugar cane. And then 16 ships had to leave Recife. 16 ships with Jews on them. 14 of them went to Amsterdam. 2 of them made their way to the Caribbean, and eventually one made their way to New York. Came in 1654 to New Amsterdam. These were not refugees. These were people who were chased out of their slaving enterprise when the Portuguese took it back. When the 14 ships got to Amsterdam, the Jews said, look, we're glad to see you, but you can't stay here. We'll take you off the ships, give you a kosher meal, a bath, some new clothes, and then we're sending your asses back out to colonize the Caribbean. And they sent them back out to Barbados, to Martinique, to Guadeloupe, to Haiti, to Jamaica, to Suriname. The colonization of the Caribbean by the Jewish community in the mid-1600s is not even understood by Jews. But it was a part of the play of the tribe, moving things around. We can't take you here in Amsterdam, but we'll send you where you can make some dough for yourself, being a part of what? The slaving system. So what became the new Amsterdam in the Caribbean after 1650? And the Jews had 3 colonial plans for this island. One was in 1651, one was in 1652, one was in 1659. And this island, some of you all go with your little bit of monies and your little bikinis and bathing suits and go down there to shop. Curacao. Curacao became the motor of the Jewish slaving enterprise in the Caribbean. It became the new Amsterdam. The Jews first went down there to organize an agricultural colony, but you can't grow nothing on Suriname. It's sand. So then they began to trade horses and things like that. Horses were for the mills, the sugar mills, in Colombia and Venezuela. Then they began to expand that trade into African enslaved peoples. And at one point in the 1600s, they got the asiento, the contract, to bring Africans to the Spanish New World. At one point, Curacao had 2,000 Jews. In the 1650s, Curacao had 2,000 Jews. That's more than all of the Jews in the United States 100 years later at the birth of the United States in 1776. Do you understand? One little island with nothing on it had more Jews than when America became independent in all of the 13 colonies. Why? Because it was the financial hub where the tribe was doing its thing. But that's not in the history books. But you all got to put it in your analysis and help you free yourself. Because if you don't free yourself from these Europeans and others, and you're going to be ripe for enslavement by Asians, and you're not going to be prepared to do what we have to do to create an African World Union, as Dr. Clark has said we should do. And as Dr. Diop has outlined in one of the works that we don't deal with him on, Black Africa. You know, I don't go anywhere without my material. But one of Dr. Diop's books, which we never deal with, of course I deal with Dr. Diop as a school of knowledge. That's why I'm so glad my brother was raising so many issues that the brother represents. But this is a work by Dr. Diop that we should deal with as well. Black Africa, the economic and cultural basis of a federated state. Dr. Diop actually called for regional African entities. A United States of West Africa, United States of East Africa, United States of Central and Southern Africa. And then link those federated states up into a continental endeavor. And then the diaspora communities can be linked up, with the United States playing a major role. So we've got to be able to see and understand all of this. Dr. Clark says we need an African revolution. The revolution has not been finished. Africans are at the crossroads. And I was saying that we're in the middle of a 50-year turning point of history of African consciousness and African revolution. After that Manchester Conference, we were dreaming of freeing the land. Within the next 20 years, a lot of that land was freed.